The principal and most consistently articulated recommendation of the World Conferences was that countries must take full responsibility for their own development. National responsibility for national development is the necessary consequence of sovereignty. The Monterrey Consensus states that each country has primary responsibility for its own economic and social development, and the role of national policies and development strategies cannot be overemphasized. National development strategies and policies are therefore critically important. This was reflected most recently at the 2005 summit when member states agreed on a target date of 2006 for all developing countries to adopt and start implementation of these strategies to achieve the internationally agreed development goals and objectives, including the MDGs.
People have been buzzing this week about a study from Johns Hopkins University on mosquitoes, genetically engineered to be resistant to malaria. The idea is to introduce the modified insects into an area affected by the disease and have them completely replace the native population. If the mosquitoes can't get infected, the logic goes, then the people they bite won't either. But to make that scheme work, transgenic mosquitoes need to outcompete the locals. So scientists at Johns Hopkins tested their ability to do this by allowing equal numbers of resistant and non-resistant mosquitoes to feed on the blood of malaria-infected mice. After 9 generations, the transgenic mosquitoes made up 70% of the population, meaning they survived better and laid more eggs than the ordinary ones, winning a head-to-head contest in the lab, though, doesn't mean the same thing will happen out in the field.
The conducted study serves to 3 objectives. The first objective is to reveal the values loaded to the child by the child-centric mother's attitude and the behavior about the effect of 5 to 6-aged nursery school children on the purchasing decision of the families who belong to high socioeconomic class. The second objective is to develop child centricity scale, and the third objective is to examine the attitude and behavior differences between low child-centric and high child-centric mothers. Analyzing the data gathered from 257 mother respondents, the researchers have found out that the lowest influence of child upon the purchasing decision of the family are those which carry high purchasing risk and used by the whole family, whereas the highest influence of the child upon the purchasing decision of the family are the products with low risk and used by the whole family. Findings also reveal that there are statistically significant differences between the high child centricity and low child centricity mothers regarding the purchasing products that are highly risky and used by the whole family.
Decision-making is central to the management of an enterprise. The manager of a profit-making business has to decide on the manner of implementation of the objectives of the business, at least one of which may well relate to allocating resources so as to maximize profit. A non-profit-making enterprise, such as a department of central or local government, will be making decisions on resource allocation so as to be economical, efficient and effective in its use of finance. All organizations, whether in the private sector or the public sector, take decisions which have financial implications. Decisions will be about resources, which may be people, products, services or long-term and short-term investment. Decisions will also be about activities, including whether and how to undertake them. Most decisions will at some stage involve consideration of financial matters, particularly cost.
Thea Proctor was just 16 when her entry at the Bowral Art Competition caught the eye of the judge, Arthur Streeton. It was the first of many associations with at-world recruits. The next year saw her at the Julian Ashton Art School in the illustrious company of Eliot Gruner, Sidney Long and George Lambert, for whom she often posed and remained her great friend until his death in 1930. Lambert's paintings and sketches of Proctor emphasize the elegance of her dress. A keen interest in fashion was just one aspect of her fascination with design, and she saw herself as an early style guru on a quest to rid Australian art of its lack of imagination and inventive design. Skilled in watercolors and drawings, Proctor did not limit herself to paper, canvases or to her popular magazine illustrations. She designed theater sets and a restaurant interior and wrote on a range of subjects from flower arranging to the colors of cars. It made for a busy and varied life, but, as she said, she was not the sort of person who could sit at home and knit socks.
When a mosquito takes some blood from a human, she may also ingest Plasmodium. The parasite ends up in the insect's gut. The mosquito immune system jumps into action as the parasites try to push through the gut wall. Most parasites do get killed, but some manage to survive that gut migration. Then they replicate and move to the salivary glands, ready to infect the next person the mosquito bites. Researchers are tinkering with specific mosquito genes to see how they affect the development of the parasite. Their goal is to develop a genetically modified mosquito with a strengthened immune system that kills all the parasites. They say next they need to get the gene into enough wild mosquitoes that they would breed and pass that gene on. No simple effort. But if it works, it could be a big victory in the war against malaria.
Our sense of cinema as a site of commercial entertainment can be traced back to the Lumiere brothers. In December 1895 they attracted a fee-paying public in Paris to sit and watch flickering images on an illuminated screen. The commercial Pandora's box they opened was to blossom in a few years into a world cinema industry and, at its peak, the fantastical Hollywood. Yet in the 30 years in which this miraculous construction was accomplished, audiences rarely had to listen to films, only watch them. Hence, the early decades of cinema were characterized by the title, silent. In fact, there was a lot of noise, machinery, audiences, musicians, and commentators. Even so, the absence of the human voice and dialogue make the films seem rather strange when viewed by a modern audience.
Daguerre continued to experiment and made, it seems by accident, an important discovery. He had put an exposed photographic plate, this was, of course, before the age of film, in his chemical cupboard and some days later found that the latent image had developed. There was also a broken thermometer in the cupboard, and he assumed that the vapor from the mercury had caused it. This meant it was now possible to reduce the time the plate was exposed from 8 hours to 30 minutes. This produced an image. The next step was to fix it, which he managed to do in 1837. He called this new process the daguerreotype, then advertised and looked for sponsors, but initially very few people were interested. The discovery was made public on January 1839, but details of the process were not given until August the same year, the French government in the meantime having bought the rights to the process.
Every day, on television, on the radio, and in the newspapers, we see, hear, and read about leaders and politicians making decisions that are clearly wrong-headed and that seem to us, the horrified watchers, listeners, and readers, counterproductive. To be reasonably impartial about such blunders, we must try to put aside for the moment how the decision might affect us as individuals. What we are looking for are decisions that are contrary to the interests of their makers. A glaring historical example of such stupidity would be the respective attempts of Charles XII, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Hitler to invade Russia despite the disasters it brought each of their predecessors. Now, when investigating these matters we must tread carefully and remember that it is wrong to judge the past by the ideas of the present.
Umami was first identified in Japan, in 1908, when Dr. Kikune Ikeda concluded that kombu, a type of edible seaweed, had a different taste than most foods. He conducted experiments that found that the high concentration of glutamate in kombu was what made it so tasty. From there, he crystallized monosodium glutamate, MSG, the seasoning that would become popular the world over. Decades later, umami became scientifically defined as one of the 5 individual tastes sensed by receptors on the tongue. Then in 1996, a team of University of Miami researchers studying taste perception made another breakthrough. They discovered separate taste receptor cells in the tongue for detecting umami. Before then, the concept was uncharted. Up until our research, the predominant wisdom in the scientific community was that umami was not a separate sense. Global climate change is the greatest environmental challenge we face. We have at most a few decades to make the necessary investments to prevent the most serious impacts of climate change. Future generations will judge us based on the investments we are considering now. In its February 2007 report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, warns that global emissions must peak no later than 2015 if we are to hold average global temperature increases to 2.4 degrees Celsius, 4.3 degrees Fahrenheit, or less. Moving to an emissions pathway that will hold temperature increases to a minimum will require a colossal effort. There is no time to lose given the long lag in research and development cycles, and energy-intensive infrastructure and product turnover. Fundamentally, altering the world's energy system is unlikely to occur within this timeframe. Evidence for a genetic basis of antisocial behavior stems from several different lines of research. First, behavioral genetic studies of twins and adoptees have demonstrated that heredity plays a role in antisocial behavior, including various forms of aggression and criminality, by finding greater concordance for such behavior in genetically related individuals, compared to non-relatives living in the same environment. Second, various correlates of antisocial behavior, including personality factors such as impulsivity, sensation-seeking, risk-taking, and callous unemotional traits, are known to be at least partly genetically influenced. Third, psychiatric outcomes related to antisocial behavior, including antisocial personality disorder, gambling, and substance use and abuse, have also been investigated in genetically informative designs, and each of these has demonstrated significant genetic links.
In prehistoric times, Europe was covered with vast primeval woods and forests, which must have deeply influenced the minds as well as the lives of our ancestors. In places where they had not made clearings, they must have jived in a constant half-light. As far as we know, the oak was the commonest and most useful tree. We get our evidence partly from the statements of some classical writers, but more convincingly from the remains of ancient villages built on wooden piles in lakes and from the oak forests which have been found embedded in peat bogs. These bogs, which are most evident in northern Europe, but which are also found in some central and southern parts of the continent, have preserved the plants and trees which flourished after the end of the Ice Age.
Computer viruses have been a fact of life at least since the 1980s, if not before. They can cause companies to lose hours of working time, and they can also spread panic among computer users everywhere. There are, however, several distinct types of computer infection, all loosely referred to as viruses, and they each work in a slightly different way. A particularly nasty one is the worm. which is a program designed to sneak its way into an entire computer network and reproduce itself over and over again. Then there is the Trojan, which strictly speaking isn't a virus, but a piece of software that appears to do one thing, but actually does something malicious instead. When the unsuspecting operator introduces it into the computer, the alien program will take over the machine. With Trojans you have to be particularly careful because they can often be introduced by way of a message advertising an antivirus product. So what motivates someone to introduce a virus into the computer systems of innocent victims? Perhaps it's simply the desire to prove that it can be done. Also in the 20th century, another famous architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, dreamed up a perfect city that got no further than the drawing board. Wright believed that what was wrong with modern cities was, in his words, rent. Ideas, land, even money itself, had to be paid for. He saw this as a form of slavery and believed that modern city dwellers had no sense of themselves as productive individuals. Thus, Wright's city was to be made up of numerous individual homesteads, and the houses themselves were to be simple, functional and in harmony with the environment. Everyone would own enough land to grow food for himself and his family. No outsiders would be allowed to come between the citizen and what he produced, or to exploit both for money. Goods and services would all be exchanged, not bought and sold for profit.
Conservationists have long debated whether the koala should go on the Australian National Threatened Species list. While the koala is clearly in trouble in some parts of the country, in Queensland, for example, high numbers are afflicted by disease. In other parts such as Victoria and South Australia the problem is not that koala populations are falling, but that they have grown to the point where they are almost too numerous. For a species to be classed as vulnerable, its population must have decreased by more than 30% over the last 3 generations or 10 years. The problem is that when such a stipulation is applied to koalas, the Victorian boom offsets the Queensland bust, and the species stays off the list. This has repercussions because northern koalas are different to southern ones. They are smaller, for example, and they contain a genetic variation not represented in the south. For this reason, a split listing has been devised. Koalas from New South Wales, the ACT and Queensland are now officially vulnerable. Those from Victoria and South Australia are not considered threatened.
A recent study reveals that the ability to walk quickly in old age is an indicator of a long life. The report examined results from recent research. The participants in the research were tested on a regular basis over an extended period of time. The researchers focused on the relationship between walking speed in the post-65 age group and longevity. They concluded that there was a direct correlation between walking speed and lifespan. A key researcher gave the explanation that this link exists because walking involves the use of many bodily functions working in unison. The heart, lungs, skeletal system, joints, muscles, nerves and brain have to work together in order to ensure a consistent speed. Damage to any of these systems may mean a much slower walking speed, which could signal medical problems.
One of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, how much of the news is biased? Can we recognize bias? The fact is, despite the journalistic ideal of objectivity, every news story is influenced by the attitudes and background of its interviewers, writers, journalists, photographers and editors. That is not to say that all bias is deliberate, but it does exist. So how can we, as readers or viewers, determine bias? Well, in the case of newspapers, it manifests itself in a number of ways, such as what events are selected for inclusion or omission. The placement of the article, meaning its proximity to the front or back pages, is significant. The use of headlines, photographs and language are further examples.
Lyrebirds, a common bird in rainforest areas of Australia, have an incredible repertoire of sounds that they are able to mimic from their environment, including over 20 other bird calls as well as sophisticated mechanical sounds. They have been known to replicate the sounds of chainsaws and pneumatic drills. The male lyrebird sings a medley of mimicry to impress females, and the more detailed and varied his repertoire is, the more interesting it seems to potential mates. Like females of other bird species, female lyrebirds do not take place in the imitating, but simply judge the competing males' symphonies. Once learned, it seems a lyrebird rarely forgets a call, and the sounds are passed down through the generations. There are some lyrebirds in Victoria, Australia, that still recreate the sounds of axes, saws and old-fashioned cameras which have not been used in the area for years.